There's little agreement about what constitutes the Baroque in architecture these days. The early 20th century art critic Heinrich Wölfflin almost made a case for defining it as a style with identifiable elements or motifs, but his definition has been broadened by others, and now it's really too broad. As things stand, many of the buildings or other artifacts that we refer to as Baroque have such little in common with each other that the term is in danger of having no meaning whatsoever. So I suggest that we start out by refining what it is we mean by the term. If this building here is Baroque, then we can come up with other names for things which aren't like it, but which are often called by the same name. That which is referred to as Baroque in town planning, like Versailles and Karlsruhe, let's refer to that by its other popular name, Grand Manner. The Jesuit buildings commissioned during the period known as the Counter-Reformation have very little to do architecturally with Borromini's church, but they do have something in common with each other. So let's call this the Jesuit style. I think Merleau-Ponty's suggestion that there are multiple conceptions of space all going on all at the same time in a work like this one, which is the Night Watch, is something we can agree is actually happening. I don't think, though, it's Baroque. I think we should call it something else. We could call it Rubenesque, but of course that term is being used for something else, so we'll have to come up with another name. I think Walter Benjamin's idea that Baroque is a phantasmagoric state of mind is something closer perhaps to Kafkaesque. So, Baroque in architectural terms refers to structures like this one, and this, and these. When we think about it, there's actually quite a few things that we can say about Baroque architecture, more than I'm going to attempt to say in this brief video. In this video, I'm just going to touch on 3 or 4 areas. I'm particularly interested in the idea that Baroque structures are what we might refer to as individuated. They are things in themselves. They don't relate to things outside of themselves in order to generate their sense of appeal. Now, I think this can be demonstrated a few different ways. One is in the area of symmetry and grids. I'm going to talk about that. Another is in the area that Jacques Derrida describes as difference. That's difference but spelled with an A. And then at the end, I'm just going to say something very, very brief about tectonics and Baroque architecture. Now, these ideas are cast over a very wide area. I just hope I can somehow keep it all coherent. In Renaissance and in a lot of modern architecture, grids and patterns are employed to create a sense of order. From an early age, it appears we understand the concept of the grid. In architecture, this concept is elevated to the level of an aesthetic, mainly, I think, because there's a sense that the concept is universal. It's shared by other people. In the type of Baroque architecture we find in Borromini's church, the grid employed is limited. It's present to the degree required to ensure that the assembly is not a chaotic mess. The grid isn't extensive enough nor explicit enough to get us into the world of the universal. Classical and modern architecture make use of translational symmetry. With translational symmetry, elements like columns or beams or even assemblies of elements can be perfectly replicated in a mechanical way. The repetition of identical elements and groups of elements is a concept which is easy to grasp, and there's a sense that the appeal is universal. In Baroque works, elements and groups of elements may sometimes exhibit translational symmetry, but very often they are mirrored axially, which is not the same thing. This next point is related to the previous one. Classical and modern modes of architecture use regular forms which allow for multiple instances of symmetry. Bramante's tempietto is circular. The circle gives rise to the possibility of many symmetries, including, say, rotational, which, when we conceptualize it, has an aesthetic which we can say is somehow universal. In Baroque architecture, where the oval is preferred, the only symmetry available is axial. This is not an appeal to a sense of universalism. Let me just elaborate a bit more on axial symmetry. I would argue that the assembly on the Capitoline in Rome by Michelangelo is an early example of a Baroque mise-en-scène, although I have to say that this isn't generally agreed. Most people don't think it's Baroque. The point I'm about to make isn't the only one that I'd use to defend the idea that this is a Baroque artifact, but it's the only one that I'll cite at the moment. This axis of symmetry is very strong, but the possibilities of other symmetries are limited. If the two palazzos were in orthogonal relationship to each other, at least one other strong line of symmetry would be suggested, and this would make the understanding of the arrangement universal. Baroque structures are individuated in other ways too. They may have a strong axial symmetry within their own domain, but they often make no appeal to a geometry or a context outside of themselves. For an example, look no further than the Capitoline. Its own internal geometry is strong, but the steps leading up to it practically collide with the steps of the adjoining structure. This is very much a Baroque idea. Here is Borromini's Al Quattrofontane in plan, located awkwardly at a corner. It's symmetrical unto itself, but oblivious to the geometries in the vicinity. As it happens, along the same street we find Bernini's San Andrea al Quirinale. It's the other structure which lays claim to being the apotheosis of Baroque expression. There is no compromise from either of these buildings in relation to what's going on around them. And finally, the cathedral in Syracuse has an almost nonchalant relationship with the space outside. I just want to connect this point back to something we mentioned earlier. We'll quickly compare these arrangements to what we find in Versailles, which you'll remember is often referred to as Baroque. These things are not the same. If the Roman examples are Baroque, then Versailles is something else. Let's try to tie all these points together. In conventional architecture, symmetry, pure form, the use of the grid, the connection of the structure to the wider order of things, these are all employed to generate a sense that the appeal of a structure is what we might call universal. We all understand the building and we all understand it in the same way. In Baroque architecture, the individual doesn't have the reassurance that others will appreciate the structure in the same way that he or she does. The appeal of the structure is to the individual's own cultural frame of reference. In a way, and this might be a bit of a stretch, the Baroque structure seeks to relate to you and to you alone. I want to touch on an area from Jacques Derrida, which I think might have a bit of relevance to this discussion. It's his notion of difference, which he spells with an A. Now, I'm going to oversimplify just one part of this whole area of theory, but Derrida suggests that phenomena exist in a binary relation to their opposites, so that there is no big without small, there's no hot without cold. And where binaries exist, now I'm reading a little bit more into it myself here, where binaries exist, our position is somewhere in between the two opposites. So let's take the binary of attraction and repulsion. Now, I wish there was a way I could graphically illustrate this, but I can't really. I have to talk my way through it. In Baroque architecture, I personally find that I'm both attracted and repelled to the work at the same time. I'm sort of caught somewhere between the two extremes. Those elements that I know to be universally pleasing in good architecture, in all good architecture, are missing in Baroque work. And that is somehow a little bit off-putting, or let's say repulsive. And then yet there's something beautiful about these buildings that just can't be denied. So that position of being caught between attraction and repulsion, well, I think that's the area where this notion of the erotic resides. So when I said in a previous video that I thought that there was something erotic, but not in a sexual sense, about Baroque architecture, this is what I was trying to get at. Now, I said I can't really illustrate this graphically, but there is a scene from the movie The Godfather which just might somehow illustrate what I'm trying to get at.
Leave the gun. Technique only.
The North American prairie is summed up in this image, but the Statue of Liberty is just on the horizon. So almost every concept we had of 20th century America and its opposite is referred to in the same image. This man is shot in the head as the other man casually urinates. It's very important that the gun is left behind, but it's equally important that the cannoli be brought home, or else the mobster's wife would be unhappy. Now, we find something a bit similar in music, the concept of mirrored symmetry. When scales are mirrored, they're the same but different. Incidentally, it's only in the Dorian mode in music that scales are exactly the same when mirrored, which is an idea worthy of development in the context of the Doric order in architecture. In Baroque architecture, the structural elements and the role they play are not made explicit. Columns and beams are not necessarily fully articulated. In Baroque, elements are sometimes fused. Columns merge with beams, and architraves merge with spandrels. There's little appeal to the general sense of what we would refer to as the architectonic. In fact, the more articulated something is, the less Baroque it feels. The comparison to the car is quite useful in this regard. Early cars were tectonic things. The key elements were articulated and sometimes interchangeable in the manner of translational symmetry. Cars of the more recent period are similar to the Baroque artifact. The symmetry of the modern car is axial, and the axiality is challenged by the location of the steering wheel, and this is almost Baroque. And if I'm in a left-hand drive version of a car and I happen to come across the right-hand drive version, that's always just a little bit sinistra. Obviously, this analogy is a little facile and it's easy to pick arguments with. There are good reasons why cars are designed this way. But if we reflect on this image, it does cast our reading of the architecture in a particular light. There are lots of other things that we can say about the Baroque mode of architecture. There's the tectonic use of stone, which I don't think is really explored. The idea of the opening and the orifice, the relationship of the inside space to the outside space, and so on. But these are all topics for other videos. I'm just going to make one more point before I leave it. Baroque architecture only really exists as a building. Plans, sections, and elevations can never really explain the Baroque experience.